Welcome, everyone. We're going to take just a second to let everybody come in, and then we'll get started on Joe's core conversation. You're welcome to unmute and chat for a minute if you like, but and then we'll start the more formal thing in a minute.
Hey, folks.
Hey.
Hey, Paige.
Morning.
Call you Joe.
So this is appropriate, just a bunch of old people talking about why the young should be seen
Right.
but not heard.
Joe, the technical term is old farts. That's the term you used in your
Okay.
talk. Just listen to it.
Hey, it's so good to see you. I am going to show the ceiling for a while because I'm still eating breakfast here in California. With me is Jim, who's hiding by not getting on at the moment. But I'll just use my picture, which is
Hi, Emma.
old woman making.
Hey.
In
Dorothy,
Burma.
are your friends in Myanmar doing okay?
Very badly. They are youth. And so, Joe, you have inspired me to give a paper at ACTC with examples of how youth are getting into politics right now and are in danger of being arrested. By then, they will have been arrested, or we will have saved them.
Yeah, well, I'd love to talk to you more about that, Dorothy.
Yeah, at ACTC and before then.
Okay, let's do that.
In any case, I'm going to put myself on mute and listen intently while I eat breakfast.
It's fun. We're going to switch gears and get started on today's core conversation. So that would be a good idea for everyone to go ahead, except for Joe, and mute themselves. I'll introduce Joe, and then everybody will have an opportunity to ask questions. The way to do that is if you go down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see a tab called Participants. If you check on that at the bottom of the window that opens up, there should be the option to raise hand. That just lets me know you'd like to ask Joe a question, and that way we won't talk on top of each other. Obviously, we'll try to make it as organic as we can, so this can be as much like a conversation as the technology will allow. But that is an easier way for us to sort of manage things. So once again, welcome everyone. I'm Charlie Thomas. This is the first of the spring core conversations. I hope you had a chance to have a look at Joe's recorded comments online. It's okay if you didn't. They'll be there by the end of this conversation. If you haven't already seen them, I'm sure you'll want to. We have another core conversation coming up in a couple of weeks with Dan Cullen, who's here with us. His will be on Rousseau, and two more this spring, Rick Camber and who's also here. Hello, Rick, and Molly McGuire. So we have a great schedule of core conversations this semester, and we're very glad that you joined us today. So let me hand things over to Joe, who will make a few comments, and then we'll open this up for everyone to participate. We will end pretty promptly at the hour mark. So if you have other things in your schedule, you don't need to worry about us having to make an awkward exit. We'll respect your time in that way. Joseph Knippenberg is a professor of politics at Oglethorpe University. He's a member of the board of directors of ACTC and an all-around good guy. So Joe, hand it off to you.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank all of you who have taken time out of your busy schedules to join us this morning. Some of you, it's a more heroic effort than others, people who are in different time zones than my Eastern Standard Time. Now, I'm going to say two things just by way of a kind of preliminary sweeping aside of things. One is the backdrop behind me is not what Atlanta looks like right now. It is a vision of a time past, and with our movement online, a snow day where school is out and we can go home and just drink wine and binge our favorite television programs is also a thing in the past. one of the regrets, I think so, one of the bad effects of the pandemic that we haven't fully come to grips with yet. No more snow days. Secondly, I will, for the last 15 minutes or so of our hour here today, be on call as the first responder to my father-in-law, who's living with us. And so I may have to duck out if there is a geriatric emergency of some sort. I hope there isn't, but that's just a kind of heads up. If I disappear from the screen, it's because there's something really urgent going on that needs my attention. So I remarked earlier on a certain kind of irony, which is that most of us here are older, not all of us, and I don't want to insult anyone. And we're talking about what Aristotle has to say about the young. And I do this when I teach the Nicomachean Ethics, and I take my role as something of my role is as to provoke students into thinking and defending their positions. And so I lay out for them why politics is not an appropriate study for them. And I draw the implication that if politics isn't an appropriate study, then in some sense, they have no business voting. And I'm countercultural in that regard, since every college or university in the United States that I know about is all in favor of various forms of civic engagement, and officially is on the record as encouraging people to vote. And I theoretically discourage them, at least on behalf of Aristotle. I don't leave it at just Aristotle says this. I ask them to try to come up with counter arguments, and then I offer them some counter arguments. And so what I try to do in the classroom setting is create a kind of dialogue between the proponents of the influence of older people in politics, and proponents of the influence of younger people in politics, or rather the proponents of age not being a consideration in political participation. And this amounts to a conversation between Aristotle on the one side and, let's say, Hobbes and Locke on the other, in the context of the class in which I raised this issue. And what I say is that Aristotle claims that the young lack a certain kind of experience, which would inform their political judgment. And Hobbes and Locke, in effect, argue that experience is not required if one has either, and I exaggerate this for the sake of clarity, method or principle, both of which enable us to dispense with experience. So if I have the right method, I can impose an order on an experience, and no experience required to deploy the method. If I have principle, experience should yield to principle. So I talk a little bit about, have them talk a little bit about, Hobbes's mathematical method or geometric method. And I have them talk a little bit about, the principles of equality and liberty that Locke articulates, and that become the framework, or I guess we would now call it the rubric, in which political action, in accordance with which political action is organized. And then the question is, do Hobbes and Locke get the last word? They certainly serve the interests of the young because they give them a claim to be heard, be listened to have influence on behalf of their capacity for articulating the principle, applying the principle, or deploying the method. And the question is, what does Aristotle have to say in response? And Aristotle's response is, you can't know which method to apply to a phenomenon unless you know something about the phenomenon that isn't based on the method. So Aristotle is, you might say, a proponent not just of philosophy, but of the pre-philosophic world out of which philosophy emerges. You have to be able to judge without relying on philosophy what your expectations ought to be. And he discusses this in the ethics in the context of a discussion of education. So he's not a proponent of, you might say, untutored experience, of bare sensation. It's experience acquired in a particular cultural or educational context, relying on the use of reason, so to speak. So I leave students with a much more complicated set of categories with which to think about, how to think about politics. It's not just a method, it's not just principle, it's kind of the conversation between reason and our experience. And I don't necessarily want them to arrive at a particular conclusion. They usually don't arrive at the conclusion that I would arrive at. That's okay. But I think they do have at least the materials to be more thoughtful about their role in politics and what it entails, and whether simply claiming I have a right or being able to dump a bunch of data on us is sufficient. One of my wife's real guilty pleasures, well, it's not guilty about it at all, is watching for like the 12th time episodes of West Wing. And I'm fond of the show. Not as fond as she is. But the method of argumentation deployed in West Wing is very much, you might say, the Young method of argumentation. It's offering a bunch of facts. And the facts allegedly speak for themselves. They all tend in one direction. And there is no, back and forth. There's no deliberation. There's no introduction of the notion of prudence. So I guess that's enough to start our conversation. I would say I think the passage in Aristotle offers a good pedagogical opportunity. It raises some interesting practical questions, and it also, I think, points to some interesting philosophical questions, which are the questions regarding the nature of our engagement with our experience, just a practical. So I'll leave it at that, and then open it up for questions, observations, and conversations. And I should say in advance that I'm not. This is the kind of talk I would give at an ACTC meeting, and I invite many of you to submit proposals to our upcoming meeting. I'm sure Charlie will say something about that at the end. And it is the basis of a conversation. It is not, the sage on the stage offering, the final word on the subject.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, queue is open. And if you can't figure out how to raise your hand, just wave and we'll get you in there. It's okay. Okay, Dorothy, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Dorothy, you need to unmute yourself.
Try the bottom left.
Thank you.
There you go.
I regret this pause for everybody to think a little bit more about this really interesting juxtaposition that you've given us and the quandaries you're throwing students into. And so I'd like to ask both Joe and Charlie, if we all promise to turn off our phones and close our doors, can we be more of a conversation and just listen to each other? Because
the technology just doesn't support it, Dorothy. You get feedback and people can't speak. I wish it weren't so, but that's just the shape of the table, I'm afraid.
okay, so having said that, I will wait for my substance to let some other people speak.
Joy, thank you for the introduction. It made me think as well. Do some of your students say, I mean, maybe what you said applies in a way the text as a whole, although it applies particularly to political science. But he also seems to say at some point that, well, if you're not already virtuous, then this text is also not really for you, because then you wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But he seems to, at the same time, maybe, does he also write the text for his son, or is that might be disputed as well? It draws a bit away from your argument, because the way you deal with the text in class, I very much appreciate.
Well, I another thing I would note if pressed in the context of the class is there's a certain irony in the apparent context of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is that it is somehow related to discourses for his students who are clearly young people, not experienced. And so that raises the question of the relationship between philosophy and politics, and how one understands but that also requires, I think it seems to me, a recognition that there are some matters that one would pursue in discussion, in philosophical discussion, that one would not pursue in the agora, in the sense of, or not pursue simply and in the same way in the agora, in the sense of, if I'm willing to entertain, for example, the rule of the philosopher king as the best regime, I'm not sure I would push that so much in an ordinary political debate, recognizing on the basis of my experience how that could be taken. A similar example, and I ranted on social media yesterday about a rather infamous member of Congress from the great state of Georgia, and suggested that her example made the case for some kind of knowledge requirement, if not only for our representatives, but also for our voters. And she confessed yesterday that she was just basically misled, or she claims to have been misled by things. She wasn't political, now she knows better. Well, she's not the only, let's just say, intellectually subpar member of Congress from the great state of Georgia. Hank Johnson is reputed to have worried about deploying more U.S. troops to the island of Guam might cause the island to sink. Now, you might say, well, that's a less pernicious form of ignorance than some of the things that Marjorie Taylor Greene had. But so I'm willing to make the case that maybe you should take an IQ test before you get to run for Congress, or maybe you should have to pass the citizenship exam before you get to run for Congress. The problem with that, with offering that kind of argument in public, is not only will people say nasty things about you, but it may license some people to exclude others from the political arena because they think they know better. That the experts will silence those, or the experts representing a certain consensus will silence anyone who isn't part of that consensus. So I prudently know when to speak and how to couch what I say and when to hold my tongue. So when I'm speaking with a group of potential philosophers in a private conversation, I hope that we understood in the spirit of the conversation, or it will provoke a certain kind of response, get people thinking. And as I said, I think Aristotle and I are on the same page, because I don't mean to silence my students, I mean to provoke them into thinking. But it does require, again, the recognition that there's a difference between philosophical discourse simply and philosophical discourse that takes place in a political context. And that awareness of that, you might say, requires a certain kind of experience.
I think I'm going to, we got Dan and Josh, so I guess I won't jump in. Dan and then Josh.
Yeah, I've got the chat box, but I don't have the raise hand function for some reason, or I can't find it. This is
It's under
really,
participants, not chat, but that's, you don't need it. It's okay.
I look there too. Okay. Joe, a couple of things. One, I'm struck in a way by the question that you raised, or the premise of it, which is that young people have a desire to participate in political life. I mean, we have a lot of evidence that they don't, and one might think the provocative thing to do is to make the case for why they should, right? You're coming at that from a different direction, and I just throw that out there as another dimension of the general topic. But I'm also wondering whether you are familiar with John Seary's argument now in a book. I discovered a book I haven't read. A few years ago, he wrote an essay saying we ought to amend the Constitution to allow young people to run for office, 25 years old for the House, 30 years old for the Senate, 35 for the president. And you know, he riffs on this this proposition: old enough to fight, old enough to vote, right? And if old enough to fight, old enough to vote, you should be old enough to run for office. And he takes up the matter of experience, the experience objection. And one thing he says is, in a democracy, we have to let the voters decide what experience is relevant, and not just prejudge it. And I'm wondering whether you're aware of John's argument. If not, I think you'd find it interesting and helpful for this very topic.
Truth be told, in the materials I give the students when we discuss this, I give a couple of links to John's pieces. So yeah, and I guess the larger question I would have is, or a larger kind of response is that our political arena is so pervaded with the devices that Hobbes and Locke recommend that I think everyone is kind of inoculated in some measure against the kind of experience that Aristotle insists upon. So it ends up being a critique of modern politics, or at least a challenge to modern politics, because we all know how to insulate ourselves from contrary facts, not just in the kind of practical sense that we curate our own social media news feeds and so on, but because, you know, we have a method, or we have principles that trump any sort of, or enable us to explain away any sort of inconvenient experience. So I don't think, I don't think that, any of us are really all that differently situated necessarily, because we have available to us all the tools in the toolbox of the young, and many of us make use of them. And Aristotle says, there's another thing about the young, and that is that they're typically passionate and don't listen to the kind of reason he wants us to listen to. And he concedes this isn't just a problem. This isn't just an issue for the young. It's an issue for lots and lots of people. So in some sense, the cult of youth, or the political cult of youth, is one that pervades our entire population right now. And I'm not about to say that because Bernie Sanders is much older than many of the people who voted for him, that he knows much better than they do. Because he's insulated himself, as have many of us in a variety of ways, from inconvenient experience that might have taught him something different. And this is not just a problem, obviously, for so-called progressives. I've got a paper I've been working on, and in some sense, the whole point of progress is to be able to put experience to the contrary behind one. But it's a problem that we all face. We have ways of insulating ourselves, talking ourselves out of experience or understandings that we find inconvenient for whatever we're passionate about or whatever we're devoted to in principle. And so, yes, John is, so to speak, an old friend. I give the students links to a couple of his articles. And, if pressed, I would have to concede the argument actually sweeps pretty broadly and would exclude most people other than me from having a voice in politics. But I don't want to go down that path.
Josh, and then Patrick, and then Dorothy.
Joe, so are you able to get students to start to question their attachment to method or principle in phrasing it this way? And let me just add an additional question to clarify what I'm asking. I think it's fair to say that experience and having recourse to it just is the obvious thing to do in politics. So to turn to method or principle instead, I think needs to be justified. I'm not saying that all students are going to be aware of that. Instead, I'm really asking the question, how do you make them aware of the fact that it was a choice to turn away from experience toward method and principle?
Well, I think most of them, here's the kind of debate that happens, that's happened at my institution in a classroom like the one I have since I've been there, which is a lot of our students, a lot of my students anyway, are cynics before their time. They don't know why they should, they've just adopted, a kind of hermeneutic of suspicion or cynicism as their point of departure. And, so the argument goes something like this: everyone is self-interested. Mother Teresa is self-interested. She does what she does because she wants to get to heaven. And that's, and so, you can point out to them that this argument sort of obliterates the distinction between Donald Trump and Mother Teresa. Now, Donald Trump is really, he is the hip pocket argument for anything, at least for the next couple of years until we've forgotten about him, which I kind of hope we do, but that's a different story. So, I think they do have a kind of method, but it is, it's not well articulated. And it's the same thing when you talk about, a lot of them are, very principled in their commitment to a kind of democratic socialism, at least, at my place. Maybe Dallas is different, but at my place, they're a lot of them are, they were all about Bernie in the, last spring, and they were willing to settle for Biden. But they don't want to be informed by experience. So, I think for someone who has been educated out of, or educated so as to be aware of the way in which, we're living in an, as supposed an enlightenment cave, which is the kind of the cave of method and the cave of principle. And trying to get out of it requires a good bit of work. Our students just inhabit it. They think it's normal, and they think that justice equals equality, and there's nothing about it that we can raise a question about. And so the principle of justice as equality applies everywhere all the time, and it's even hard to get them to see the sort of very sober Aristotelian correction of that in the politics, which is, justice is equality for equals and inequality for unequals. They can't imagine a way in which inequality ever should matter until I tell them, and this, is one way of exploding it. Well, then everyone should get the same grade, and that grade is the fair grade, the median grade. Everyone should get a C. Or that another way of doing it is you put them into a little study group or a little working group, And all of a sudden, they become very concerned about how not everyone is pulling his or her weight, and the people who don't pull their weight shouldn't get the same grade as the people who do pull their weight. Okay, there we go. They've gained a certain kind of experience, which bursts their methodological or principle bubble.
Patrick, you're up, and then Dorothy.
I think Aristotle says in the Rhetoric that the young are principled or idealistic, and the old are cynical. And it looks like you become cynical because you were so principled or idealistic. So that speaks a little bit to what you were saying, Joe, about cynical too early, but might be also principled too early leads to the early cynicism. But I was thinking, I wanted to ask about the beginning of book 2, the very beginning of book 2 of the Ethics, where Aristotle brings up again experience and time. And at the very beginning, I think he says something along the lines that the experience that is needed, at least for intellectual virtue, is a kind of just teaching, he says, is teaching. And so I guess I'm curious, because he says other things too, and in the passage that you're especially focused on, but what exactly is the experience that's needed? I guess I'm curious about that, because, you know, it's not just your average life. It doesn't look like that would make someone fit for politics. So there must be a particular kind of experience that's important, or kinds of experience. So I'm wondering if you have what you do with that in the classroom.
Well, the context in which he says the young are not appropriate students of politics is one where it's closely connected to or preceded immediately by a discussion of education. So I take this in part to mean experience is not just a collection of sensations, but something that is organized by reason in a kind of context. So experience is mediated by education, conversation, by reason. So it's not just that I have, you know, grown old many days, but also that I have thought and talked in a particular way about what I'm seeing or experiencing. And so, you know, I think how to put it, for Aristotle, if you look at one of the ways to think about it is to go to book 3, chapter 11 of the Politics, where he makes the case for what we would now call deliberative democracy, that the collective judgment of the many can be superior to any other collective judgment if only, you know, the many contribute, each member of the many contributes what he or she knows and is modest about what he or she doesn't know. Aristotle qualifies that immensely, very much right away. But he segues from that in chapter 11 to a discussion of the claims of expertise. And he mentions 3 different kinds of experts. And one is the craftsman, the second is the master craftsman, and the third, someone who is educated with respect to the art, but who by implication is neither a craftsman nor a master craftsman. You know, I take that to mean someone who knows enough about something to be able to form a judgment, but hasn't suffered from the narrowness of you know, becoming the expert. And I take that to be in some ways the liberally educated person. You gotta know something about, if you want to have a conversation about politics in our time, you gotta know something about economics. You have to know something about science. You have to know, and you have to know something about human character. I had a conversation with a potential guest lecturer at Oglethorpe via Zoom yesterday, and we were discussing tyranny. And some of you may be familiar with Waller Newell's books on tyranny, which are quite good. And well, Newell, who I know as Randy, not as Waller, distinguishes between 3 different kinds of tyrants. And his book comes from a position of immense learning. And one could look, apply those categories to our contemporary world and discern something that one wouldn't discern just on the basis of what one gets by looking at the world and reacting to it without this kind of learning. So, one of my students might say, "Orange man bad, awful human being." Someone who'd read Newell's books might say, "Orange man looks kind of like a traditional tyrant." Other people in our political arena might look much more like either reforming or millenarian tyrants. The difference is not the kind of tyranny. It's not tyranny. It's just the sort of ramifications and justifications of it. So I acquire experience not just by living, but by living thoughtfully, talking to people, learning from them, being modest about what I know and don't know. And yes, politics does require a certain kind of expertise, or it arguably does. Aristotle doesn't settle that question for us, and he raises the question of, at the end of his discussion in Book 3, Chapter 11, he offers 3 examples of the kind of expertise one might have. Is the household manager or the home builder the better judge of a house? Is the pilot or the shipbuilder the better judge of the ship? Is the diner or the cook the better judge of a meal? Those are 3 somewhat different images that could be applied to politics. And the only one that is purely democratic in the way that we now say it is, or understand it, is the diners as the best judges of the meal. And I have a kind of knockdown, completely irrefutable rejection of that argument that all my students have said to. And I say this, that in recent years, someone did a poll, and it turns out the best Mexican restaurant in the entire United States is Taco Bell. If that isn't an argument against democracy, simply, I don't know what is.
I think that's your cue, Dorothy, and then Mr. Sutton, you're next.
Well, we have so many more ways of jumping into politics than was true in ancient Athens. And so the part in which the book of, book 8 of the Ethics, Aristotle says, the young are friends for pleasure. And probably a number of us have had the pleasure of joining a large crowd of people on the street who were protesting or advocating something. And so there are the young in politics. But what I really want to go to is method, because I think that in your videotape talk, Joe, you were counterposing the way Aristotle thinks against method. But in my understanding, he has a fundamental method of looking at experience, and this is the 4 causes. And so I was so glad that you sent me back to the book, and where he says in book 1, part 4 that you put in front of us, that the complexity of the subtlety or the inability to be clear about politics is what makes it so hard for the young to grasp. And so I thought a bit about what he says about the nature of understanding the 4 causes. And of course, if you get to something which is really simple, like the material cause of a chair, in different places, he says it's the a lead, it's the demi, it's the citizens, and of course he's very clear that the minority of elsewhere, the minority of people are not are the citizens. And so even the material is tough. And then you get to the form, which should be pretty easy. The form of a chair is a shape that gets you off the ground in order, get you off the ground. And that form, he says in different places that it's well, he's clearest about bronze casting, that the form is the theory of how to do it. It's not the cast. It's so that when you're talking about the that for which it is the final cause, you're into the good life, which of course is very amorphous. And so I'm saying he's got a method, and he's saying that his method lets you look at experience in a very special way, in which you're trying to get at what makes things the way they are, the causes. And so, sure, politics is too complicated for the young to be lawgivers, but it's not so complicated that they can't make a choice between who will be president.
I guess my suggestion would be that in book 1, chapter 3 of the ethics, he says, you don't have the same sort of expectations of certainty from, let's say, politics as you do for mathematics. And you have to know the appropriate, you have to have appropriate expectations. And he says you gain the appropriate expectations, implies you gain it through education. So it's, in some sense, how you deploy reason and what you expect of reason depends not simply upon some kind of, I don't know how, I'm struggling for the formulation here, but depends on something other. It's not self-justifying in the sense that, let's say, Hobbesian geometric method is self-justified, or an appeal to principle is self-justified. I have to know, I have to make a decision about what to expect. That if the method gives it to me, then either it's built on thin air or it's a more adequate method. And that's, I think, the open question.
Mr. Sutton, and then Rick.
So Dorothy's question kind of anticipated mine, and it was originally inspired by Patrick. Ultimately, what I was going to ask is what would Aristotle think of Marshall McLuhan? And and the reason I wanted to ask that is kind of related to Patrick's question of, like, where does this maturity come from? And then I was kind of thinking, well, and how, like, or his was kind of, how does it happen? Also kind of where, because these media we're choosing for our discussion would make anyone cynical quickly. There's no common premise from which the discussion's occurring. It's sort of chaotic. And so I just wonder if the sort of discourse platforms we're choosing from which to engage in quote unquote politics, if he would even think that these platforms, and here's where I'm channeling McEwen, could even be verified as being a place where reason is one of the premises on which the discussion's occurring. I always joke with my students, we're going to have a national conversation on race. Who wants to go first? How do 350 million people speak it? Anyway, so that's, I'm riffing too much, but take it as you wish.
Well, I mean, I think if you want to suggest that our political arena as either a largely anonymous internet arena or as a so-called national arena where people are, we might know their names, we really don't know much about them. I think from Aristotle's point of view, that's a huge problem. Politics occurs in conversation where you have reliable access to information about the character of your interlocutor. There's the ideal size of the city, and we're way beyond that. And that, I will often make that argument too. Ask my students, how many of you are personally acquainted with your United States senators, with your representative, with your state rep, with your city council person? And I can make the claim that a few years ago, I actually ran into my state representative at Starbucks, and we had, I'd known him, so we had a conversation. Turns out there were things I didn't know about him that were ultimately scandalous, but that's okay. But the more local the level, the more likely you are to have to be acquainted with someone who knows the person, and you get reliable information. Right now, we're dealing with, in effect, every conversation partner other than someone we know is a kind of avatar. It's a persona. It's not a person, and there's no interest in maintaining the relationship or cultivating it or even learning from it. So I'm occasionally, very occasionally, the recipient of hate mail. And I was also, our students created a social media account, an Instagram page, where they could complain about anything they wanted to complain about anonymously. And that you can imagine where that went, and it's no fun. And it basically demoralized our entire faculty. Because it's kind of like Yelp applied to us, and it's even worse than what you'd get in student evaluation or anything like that. And it's convenient for the students, and it may bring to the surface some issues that wouldn't otherwise be brought to the surface, but it doesn't do it in a very helpful way. And yes, so we don't have an appropriate arena for politics because none of our political institutions are on a sufficiently intimate scale. And even the ones that are where it's possible to know one another, Congress, state legislature, they're playing for this larger audience, and they're really just creating personas or avatars for that larger audience. They're not really cultivating relationships. I suppose the example I would give to my students, but it's already dead history now for them, is the cordial relationship between two recently deceased members of the Supreme Court, Scalia and the notorious RBG, who got along personally, could have conversations, but they each have a kind of howling mob holding them up as their standard bearer, who want nothing to do with the other side. They should learn from that. They may, but again, it's already sort of ancient history for them, since these people died a few years ago. And are no longer on the scene. So I do think that you're right. There's no venue for what Aristotle would call politics. There still is a venue for what Aristotle would call education in this context, and it is the residential liberal arts college, where students speak, get to know one another. Professors and students can have conversations. I'm not in a MOOC, or I'm not speaking anonymously to a crowd of thousands. I don't much like this is a relatively intimate online venue, and I know some of you reasonably well, others not so well. Patrick and I have communicated via Facebook, and it's nice to see you. But this is, the sooner we can get back to in-person instruction in a relatively intimate setting where professors and students know one another, that is still possible. And that's, the degree to which that translates into or carries over into our public life, I think, is an open question. Going back to John Seary, Dan mentioned earlier, a number of years ago, wrote a book called America Goes to College, which I recommend to all of you. Part of it's just about how the liberal arts college can be a kind of school of citizenship. And if people come to their interactions with others with whom they disagree with the habits cultivated in the liberal arts classroom, and I think those are deeply imperiled now for a variety of reasons. We can go into that, and I would recommend to you a couple of books recently published. Zena Hitz's Lost in Thought, and another one that I'm reading right now called Let's Be Reasonable by Jonathan Marks, who's at Ursinus. Both celebrating in some way the prospects of a kind of liberal education. And so, the more Americans who go to college in that way, and I said, I have some modest hope for it, but I think it's a very imperiled institution for a variety of reasons. The healthier our polity will be.
We have just a bit less than 10 minutes to go in our session. Time is flying by, and I want to make sure we get our last two folks in here. So Rick, you're up, and then Paige.
Joe, I'm curious, when you have these conversations with your students about participation in politics, whether some of them say to you, it's pretty simple. It's a matter of promoting what I'm interested in. I'm concerned about student debt. I want to support candidates that are likely to cancel student debt, or I'm concerned about climate change because I'm going to have to live in a world where climate change is going to be very threatening, or I'm concerned about racial discrimination because I'm a victim of racial discrimination. So I don't need a lot of wisdom. What I need to do is simply to identify the people who are best going to represent my interests.
But the difficulty is identifying the people who will best represent your interests, because it does require that you interrogate your interests and understand how they can be best pursued. So, I think a lot of my students, and I will ironically thank them for all the benefits that they're supporting for me, and say, thank you. I'll just hand the debt on to you. And the way I talk about that is in terms of Machiavelli, Prince, chapter 16 and 17, where he talks about the difficulties of being liberal in the classical sense while in politics. Because if you be liberal in a way that's going to be recognized, you end up spending too much money, and you end up having to cease being generous. And Machiavelli's recommendation is an imperialistic foreign policy. So you take from people who don't vote for you, or who you don't care about, and your people don't care about, and give to your people. And then, we've gone that one better. We just take from future generations. They're not even here yet to complain. And so, I thank my students all the time, kind of ironically. We're getting more government than we're willing to pay for. And maybe you can keep doing this for pass on more debt to the next people. But most people, I think, can recognize that more government than we're paying for is not what's the word we like to use? Not sustainable. They like sustainability. Well, let's have a government that's sustainable, or raise the question about that. So I think I can raise questions about what it means to represent interests well. And it may be occasionally requiring that we say no about certain things. And I've sort of been interested to see how people respond to the promise to relieve student debt. My daughter, who's got a very modest student debt, keeps asking, when are they going to do this? When are they going to do this? And then I have friends who are politically on the left who have let me know in certain terms that they're not terribly enthusiastic about this proposal, because somehow it feels like they they paid off their student loans, and they struggled and they suffered. So I think it's complicated, and you can make it complicated. And so it is always, knowing what your own good is. And I guess I'll shut up there to either let you respond or give Paige her moment of time.
I think somebody, I would like to respond, but then we're running out of time. So I think, Paige, you've got your hand up. I think you should take the floor.
Oh, thank you, guys. And I hate to bring up another text at this very late moment, but Joe, I was wondering, I have been struggling with, I even struggle to pronounce it, theaetetus, the Socratic dialogue. Are you familiar with it?
It's been years, but I have a nodding acquaintance.
Okay, which is better than mine, probably. And in it, Socrates is talking to a 16-year-old, sort of almost a prodigy, a young philosopher. And you remember there's a frame narrative at the beginning that says this young man is going to grow up and be great in battle and as a mathematician. So you're talking, Socrates and the 16-year-old. And Socrates uses this famous extended metaphor of the midwife. And that may be one of the best known parts of the dialogue. And he says that a great midwife is past the time of giving birth, understood giving birth to ideas, but the youth, the person who's still fertile, has the ideas. So it's a different image. And I wondered if you could throw that image, the teacher as now barren, but helps birth the idea.
Well, there are two things I would say sort of off the cuff in response to that. One is, certainly Aristotle and Plato both concede that mathematics is something that's accessible to the young, because it's pure reason based on no experience whatsoever. And so that theaetetus as a mathematician, I think, is not insignificant. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong, who's read the dialogue more recently. This is also the dialogue in which they try to understand what it means to be human. They come up with the definition featherless biped. Is that right? Or is it's in the trilogy? It's either in the theaetetus.
It's later in the trilogy. It's in the sophist.
It's in the sophist. Okay. But that's, mathematics, when pure reason applied to politics yields a definition of an understanding of humanity, which, is rational in the sense it's based on a series of intelligible distinctions, but really doesn't get at what it means to be human. I guess what I would say is the giving birth, I do help my students, or we should help our students think for themselves. I don't think that requires that we be barren. It just requires that we not give those who are giving birth our children. Substitute our children for theirs.
That's a flashy answer. Very good.
I guess we're at 11 o'clock almost.
We really are. This has been fantastic, and I'm sorry there hasn't been more time for follow-ups. I sense that there would have been a lot of back and forth had we had more time and different space. So thank you all for coming and asking great questions. Thanks especially to Joe for both his great responses to your questions and for the recording that he did. This will also be up on the website, a recording of this conversation right next to Joe's recorded remarks. Before we say goodbye, Joe's right. I would love to see each of you back at our conference this April. We'll be online April 12th to the 16th. There's lots of information on our webpage, cortex.org. And if you haven't been to an ACTC conference before, just know that we require short papers focused on a primary text and have longer sessions so that there can be conversation. And so we'd love to have more conversation with you. So please join us in April. But finally, thank you, Joe, so much. Thank you.
Thank you for a very stimulating conversation.
All right. Take care, everybody. See you
Bye.
soon. Bye.